Today's speaker, Professor Thomas Cameron. Thomas is a Professor of Applied Ecology at the University of Essex, with a particular interest in how populations and communities respond to environmental change, predation, and management. Today, he'll be talking to us about how evidence-based and adaptive decision-making can support the sustainable management of waterbird harvest in the UK and Europe, particularly within protected areas. So without further delay, I'll hand over to Thomas.
Thank you very much, Chloe. So if I straight into here. So I have a background in kind of more experimental and theoretical ecology, and in 2014 found myself moving to a new job in Essex, in the Essex coastline, the most south I've ever been. Didn't think I'd last long here, but now love it. And I found myself working in a landscape that looks like this, completely alien to me, really quite fantastic coastal landscape. And over the last 12 years, I've now kind of been shifting, I guess, what I do to kind of apply these kind of more theoretical and experimental ecology approaches to more and more kind of field and applied approaches to solve problems of nature recovery and how people and nature can coexist. And the practices that we do as humans that becomes more sustainable in these coastal and aquatic environments. And so I asked one of the AI tools over the summer to try and come up with an infographic that tries to explain what I do. It didn't do a great job, but it did what's on the left. And it did a reasonable job in that I don't have particularly much, taxonomic affinity. I kind of move around a lot when it comes to taxa, but I am largely interested in how demographic responses of organisms, whether they be plants or animals, and the study of those demographic responses of organisms can be used to try and solve problems that society might say they have. And so my group does a lot of work on restoration ecology, whether that's be habitats like salt marshes and seagrasses, and also a lot in both restoration aquaculture and commercial aquaculture, and trying to look at the ecosystem functions and services that these coastal habitats and coastal food production has. And also looking at the interactions between humans and wildlife. That's both in a fishery sense, but also more recently in a different type of harvesting sense, when we think about how the kind of consumptive activities of humans, whether that be public access, being consumptive because it effectively predates waders on beaches, or the actual deliberate consumptive activity of humans, for example, in hunting, if we have enough data to be able to solve some of the conservation challenges that these activities raise. So the rest of the talk today will be about this idea that, if we're harvesting wildlife, regardless of what it is, although today's talk is about waterbirds and the legal harvest of waterbirds, but if we harvest wildlife, how do we make sure that it's sustainable? So do we harvest wildlife? Yes, we harvest wildlife, and we harvest wildlife quite substantially. And we do it both commercially and recreationally. The next question is, given that we harvest it, do we consider the sustainability of that harvest? And that might seem like a silly question, because it's very widely known that we often consider the sustainability of marine fishing, particularly commercial marine fishing. We now, more than we did in the past, also consider the sustainability of recreational fishing, particularly in a marine context, and less so in freshwater fishing. More and more often, we're now beginning to look at that in terms of the harvest of wild birds, both when they are rear and released birds, the sustainability of the rear and release activity of game birds, as well as the sustainability of the harvest. And we often look at the sustainability of the harvest of wild mammals, largely with deer, concluding that we're not harvesting enough. But for the rest of today, we'll be looking at the topic of wild bird hunting. These data on the graph on the right are a graphical representation of Nicholas Abisher's game bag census work from 2019. This includes all legally harvested wild birds and the estimates of how many millions of those birds are harvested in a given year. This is, I think, is 2016. It includes pheasant, red-legged partridge, and all mallard, and that mallard will be a mix of rear and released mallard that are released by shoots alongside pheasants for shooting, as well as wild mallard, and then all the other species of legally harvested waterbirds. And you might say, well, do we even need to look at this for wild waterbirds? Clearly, this picture is dominated by rear and released birds. But this is very easy. We can remove the contribution of pheasants and red-legged partridges, and immediately the scales change, and you think, oh, wait a minute, we're harvesting maybe quite a substantial number of wild waterbirds. The estimate is 1.4 million waterbirds were harvested in the United Kingdom in 2016. That number stayed about the same probably since about 2012. But a large proportion of them, if we look at mallard there in the bars on the left, are from rear and released birds. And I'm going to come back to that later in the talk. So if we think that a large proportion of the approximately 1 million, if it's just ducks, about 1 to 1.1 million ducks that are harvested, and a large proportion of them, something between 50 and 80% of them, will be from rear and released mallards by shoots. Should we be concerned? Well, I have reasons for concern that we should still be looking at the harvest of wild waterbirds. One, and it's the main topic of this talk, is the uncertainty in how many of those birds we're actually harvesting. Of that 1.4 million waterbirds, we have an estimate of somewhere between 21 and 89,000 widgeon are harvested from a UK wintering population with a mean estimate of 450,000. Now, just based on understanding of sustainable harvest and simple percentage-based approaches, if that number is closer to 21,000 widgeon that's harvested, I'm not particularly concerned. But if it's at 89,000, I am beginning to get concerned. That's a significant proportion of that 450,000. And the truth is, we don't know whether it's closer to 21 or 89,000. And that's just in the UK. We share our flyways with lots of other countries. With the same, the widgeon that we hunt is from the same populations of birds that breed and are then hunted in Russia and Finland and Latvia and Holland. I can go on. So this scale requires attention. And of course, these birds are being harvested on top of other things that are happening. Climate change and habitat loss, our populations increasing, decreasing, shifting in distribution. We don't have all the answers to those questions, and so there's multiple pressures. I'm also concerned about behaviour, and what I mean by that is the sustainable behaviours. So largely today I'll be talking about the cold numerical sustainable harvest of waterbirds, in the same way we might ask the same question about fish. But another way to look at sustainability is of behaviours. And I'm not sure that I'm seeing entirely sustainable behaviours. These are some pictures from social media. We're going to see quite a few of them today, especially later in the talk. And these are birds that are harvested and then totally legally. There's nothing illegal in any of these pictures. But, these are birds that are being used for pet food, birds that are being offered for free. The top right one really had a lot of negative reaction from hunters, where someone said, hey, I'm going to be out shooting teal with my friends tomorrow. Who wants some? And they had 70 teal free. Nothing illegal there. They could have been sold. But, is this a sustainable behavior? People are hunting more than what they need to eat themselves. So I began to get a motivation for action to start to look at these questions. And there were other motivations. We see a very site-based precautionary approach to conservation in the UK, and some of that is for really good reason and has really good outcomes. But it does often result in quite a lot of conservation conflicts. Often we say there's too many knowledge gaps and then we must bring in the precautionary approach. But actually, are we just risk averse? Is there not enough data already to be able to ask questions with less of a precautionary approach? Some of the other things we see that don't make a lot of ecological sense is this idea of color-coded birds. We see a lot of the social media posts saying, why are we hunting amber-listed birds? With maybe a lack of understanding of why those birds are amber-listed and whether that is related to the sustainability of the harvest of those waterbirds. And so I wanted to look at that question. And finally, one of the reasons for motivation for action is kind of why not? Like harvest management is a really old discipline and it's been applied to waterbirds all around the world. We're just not very good at doing it in Europe and particularly behind the curve in the UK, even though we have the science expertise and the infrastructure and, as I hope to show you, the data in place. Released mallards are tricky, but I think we can resolve that. And ultimately, there's an EU task force, a Flyway working group that's already started this work, and I feel that the UK should get on board. So today I'm going to be focusing on 3 questions: the sustainability of the UK national harvest of waterbirds, the uncertainty in that estimate of the harvest, and where is that harvest occurring? And does it matter where that harvest is occurring in terms of how much faith or certainty we can have in our estimates of what the total UK harvest is of waterbirds? If there is time, I will skip through some other things to be able to show you that we are working on it, and you can always come back to us in the future to see more about those results or ask me some questions about it. So why don't we already do kind of bespoke harvest management with quotas and other approaches as we do with fisheries with wildlife? Well, there's actually a lot of barriers in place to this, and most of them are actually cultural. You know, we have hundreds of years of feudal wildlife ownership in Europe and the UK. That's not the case elsewhere in the world. And because of those hundreds of years of feudal wildlife ownership, our legal systems completely support that feudal ownership. And we have often inflexible statutes that would require further primary legislation to change and move away from that. Another common argument, and one that hopefully you'll take away from this that I don't support, is that we have imperfect data and therefore we can't act. We have no legal hunting bag return data in the UK, that's for sure. And the same that we don't have legal marine recreational fishing data returns. It's all voluntary. And we have no Eurasian breeding waterfowl survey because it is actually extremely difficult to, for example, survey all the boreal wetlands of Russia. It's difficult politically and at mass expense in the way that that is done elsewhere, for example, in North America or in Australia. There are actually very few long-term dedicated ringing studies of waterfowl anymore. It's been on massive decline. And there are all of these reasons that are barriers to this imperfect data we've recently covered in a review published in Wildlife Society Bulletin. So I recommend you look at it. But we can overcome these barriers. The data is often said it's not good enough, but actually we have a whole discipline, a lot of it based here in the United Kingdom historically, where we overcame the barriers to data not being good enough by starting with simple population models. Fishery science, the entirety of fishery science is built on imperfect data. Surplus production models that are actually quite dangerous if you don't think about the uncertainty that's involved in the estimation of parameters from imperfect data have allowed us to start moving towards sustainable harvest of fisheries, even when we don't have all the data yet. They're not risk-free, but as long as you manage that risk and be aware of it, then maybe if we start treating ducks a bit more like fishes, we could make some progress. One of the tools that has allowed us to be able to do that with birds is a series of papers, largely focused on this piece of work by Neil and Leberton in 2005, where they developed this thing called the demographic invariant method. It sounds much more fancy than what it is. It basically says that if you have some data, if you find collecting some data easy and other data not so easy, if we understand the correlation between those two pieces of data, we can predict one from the other. When we're trying to think about harvesting, one of the most important pieces of data is productivity. How many new birds, how many new fishes are recruited into the population for every given current adult? Really important piece of information when you're looking at the sustainability of harvesting. But that's very difficult data to collect. But if we know the correlation between some data that's easier to collect from birds, for example, maybe their body weight or their wing length or their lifespan, then maybe we can estimate that productivity. And it turns out that for birds, there's a really strong relationship between things like body size and generation time and their productivity. So if we have some data from birds that would allow us to estimate their maximum annual productivity, such as generation time and body mass, maybe adult survival data, then we could estimate what the maximum potential growth rate of a population of those birds could be. As soon as we have that, we could infer what the maximum potential harvest would be that population could sustain before it starts to decline. Around the kind of late, approaching 2020, basically is an easier way to say that, we have this work from Cyril Derrod and Fred Johnson and others that begin to take that method of Neil and Lemberton and pull it into an R package. So really we see an explosion of activity across the world trying to assess the sustainability of wild bird harvests, both in a hunting context, but also in a bycatch context, as soon as this package is published. It implements the approach of Neil and Lemberton, and it allows a user to control the uncertainty or the certainty they have in given different parameters. It's a stochastic simulation that allows you to build the unknowns into your estimation of what might be sustainable or not. There's a series of fixed inputs and some potential policy approach inputs. This is called the harvest safety factor. I'll come back to that. And this is what we have used in order to approach estimating what might be considered an unsustainable harvest of waterfowl in the United Kingdom. So you need the data, you need the input data, you need these matrices of data of what the population size might be. Use the invariant demographic invariant method to estimate what the maximum productivity might be. And then we need some data on the estimated harvest. And we have these data in the United Kingdom. Most of you will be familiar with the Wetland Bird Survey that gives us an estimate of our midwinter population size of waterbirds in the UK. We have the data from Nicholas Abisher's National Game Bag Census that gives us an estimate and its variance of the harvest of those waterbirds around the same time. And we can take this, if we actually have published adult survival rates of these waterbirds, for example, from BTO ringing data, then we might be able to infer the maximum population growth. And if we don't have that, we can use the body mass of these birds and their life history to make a demographic invariant method prediction of what that maximum growth might be. Now, I said earlier that you can have some policy approach to this, and that's what's called harvest safety factors. So you could imagine for a bird that is not of conservation concern or non-native, maybe a Canada goose, you're quite happy for someone, for the population of hunters to harvest maybe up to 50% of the annual production of that species before you're concerned about overharvest. But instead, if you have a population that is already of conservation concern, maybe the common potsherd, you might say, no, that would be too much. I want to be concerned about this species if hunters are already harvesting 10% of the maximum production of that population. And we have built those policy concerns a priori into our analysis. So anything that is amber or red listed, for example, we might have put a lower safety factor in than we have those that are of IUCN green or non-native. To give you a very brief example, this is the wintering population size for mallard. It includes wild birds and the releases. That means that in winter we have 3.3 million mallards. We have an estimate of harvest of 940,000 mallards in the United Kingdom, and we have a published adult survival estimate of 0.627. That's from a North American population that the BTO use. We now know it's actually very similar to what's in the UK. We can take the pop harvest model and we get an inferred maximum population growth of 1.9 odds, and that gives us maximum production of those mallards multiplied by the growth rate. So we have 3.2 million surplus, in quotation marks, mallards joining the population. So we know that 940,000 are harvested, and we can divide that by this surplus production multiplied by the safety factor of 0.5. This results in a sustainable harvest index of 0.58, and because that's below a value of 1, we would conclude that that is a sustainable harvest. We're going to do this a bit more in a stochastic simulation in the next slides, which means that those estimates will have confidence intervals. But hopefully this gives you an idea of how we come about with the Sustainable Harvest Index. So in these plots that you see now, there are two plots. They're exactly the same. The plot on the left is a plot of the calculated Sustainable Harvest Index against short-term wintering trends of each of the species. The plot on the right is the same, but of long-term wintering trends. And this was this kind of, one of the reasons that birds get color-coded at amber, red, or green is because we're concerned about wintering trends. When we look for any statistical relationship between species sustainable harvest index and any of the trends, there is none. There's no statistical relationship that we can find between whether we evaluate a species to be sustainably harvested or unsustainably harvested and the population trend. And maybe that's expected. Maybe it's an unfair test because the SHI we're calculating is a snapshot in time, and the trends are governed by things that occur over time. So maybe the harvesting was unsustainable in the past. The other thing is that there's no relationship just between the categories of red or amber or green and whether or not there's a SHI above 1 or below 1. And again, this is expected. Our colour coding of birds of conservation concern is often very little to do with their actual threats that they face at any one point in time. It can be that they are amber listed because we have lots of them in the UK as a proportion of the total population size. The population could still be stable or growing and be amber listed. Despite that, if we took it the big black line down the middle of each plot, most of the species sit on the left-hand side of those lines. So for most of our ducks and all of our waders that are legally harvested, the Sustainable Harvest Index sits below 1. But for several geese, they sit above 1, particularly British grey-lag geese and Canada geese, and also Icelandic migratory geese that sit. And we knew this about Icelandic grey-lag geese. We know they're being unsustainably harvested in the United Kingdom and outside the United Kingdom. So this gives us some faith that these results might be onto something. But there's a problem, and that's because the published survival estimates that we might use to infer maximum population growth rate of waterbirds, well, there's two problems with them. A lot of the published survival estimates on the BTO website are actually from American studies. It took a while to find that out, but a lot of them are just the most recent estimate, or an estimate that seems reasonable, or a method that seems reasonable. They aren't always to do with British or European populations. The second reason is that the demographic invariant method, it wants to use a survival estimate of a waterbird population, but only its natural survival rate. And almost all of the survival rates that we have estimated from ringing studies include hunting mortality. And that means that the mortality of the species is not its natural survival rate. And you can see this in this plot from the BTO in the right here. We've got birds of different body weight, and you can see widgeon sitting way off the annual adult survival curves that you would expect for a bird of its taxonomy and its body size. And this is actually from quite an old study of widgeon in the United Kingdom, but nonetheless, this is what you would expect for a hunted waterbird. Its survival will be lower than what you would expect based on its body size alone. And so because our survival data, our published survival estimates, are underestimating survival, they're overestimating the maximum potential growth. And this is a problem. In this slide, I have both. I have the maximum production of some different waterbirds as estimated by the reported survival estimates for these species on the bird fact files from the BTO, and then those that use the demographic and variant method using body size and life history alone. And you can see you get quite a difference between the red column, you look at the plot on the left, the red column and the purple column. And this is completely different results, and it affects the calculation of the Sustainable Harvest Index. So until we have better data for UK and European survival and productivity of our waterbirds that we hunt, we really must use this demographic and variant method option in the pop harvest package. As you can see, by doing so, it tells us that we should be concerned about the sustainability of the harvest of some species, maybe mallard, maybe teal, in a way that the other method did not. We must look at all levels of uncertainty. I told you there that we must use this demographic invariant method by only using the body size and the life history of these organisms as a means to predict what maximum population growth rate is. The pop harvest system comes with 4 potential models: long-lived waterbirds, short-lived waterbirds, long-lived waterbirds that have lots of young, long-lived waterbirds that have less young, and so on. And it's very difficult to know exactly where amongst those models that you should put your mallard, put your gadwall, put your goose. And so what we decided to do was use all the models and predict what the Sustainable Harvest Index it would be with any of those models. And that is not because we're trying to be overcautious, it's because we genuinely, it's very difficult to know exactly where it would fit. And it just gives us a bit more faith in the results. And we can see there that across all 4 different models, we maybe should be asking questions about mallard and teal, maybe less so about widgeon, and we should be asking some questions about gadwall, although we genuinely think that's because we're underestimating the population size of gadwall in the United Kingdom at the moment. So one of the reasons why I jumped on the chance to speak to you is because in response to this work, the JNCC got in touch with us because they wanted to commission some follow-ups. In fact, it was open tender, but we responded to it because it was actually something that we intended to do. This was a snapshot. We actually titled it an initial estimation of the sustainability of the wild water bird harvest. We knew there was more work to do. And so we responded to this tender to review the robustness of our own work. Maybe a bit naughty, but that we won that tender. We knew that work needed done, and we knew exactly what needed to be done. I'm going to talk about that briefly. But more importantly, what they also wanted us to do was to review the data availability and quality for estimating harvest in the UK. And it's a 102-page report. It's quite a beast. I do recommend you read it, though, if you're interested. It's on your website. One of the reasons that this was needed is because, unlike in many other nations in Europe and across the world, hunters do not have this obligation to register and return data at the end of the season. And I think one of the things that you'll see that comes out of that report and some others we've done is it's probably time that we started to look at that. Until then, almost all the approaches we have to estimate harvest are statistical sampling approaches. So first we'll look at the robustness of the approach. So in the pop harvest package, we used for that first paper, the results I've already showed you, what's called a population excess growth. The language is quite kind of leading. It suggests that there's more growth in the population than the ducks or geese or waders need. And that means that you can harvest a bit of it, exactly as you would expect in fishery science. And that's what we did. But there's another approach called the prescribed take level, and it's said by the package authors and by an EU task force to be a more robust approach to thinking about whether or not you're unsustainably harvesting waterbirds. Both of the methods allow you to specify an appetite for risk, this F objective, this do I take half of the surplus production or only a small proportion? The approach we did in the first paper asks, is the current harvest sustainable? Whereas the other approach, the prescribed take level, asks what harvest would be sustainable. So what we did is we took this second approach, the PTL approach, and instead of picking an appetite for risk, this F objective, we looked at it across all of them and combined them. So in the plot on the left, you see some examples where you have the probability of exceeding the sustainable harvest index of 1 for different F objectives based on the current harvest that we're doing in the UK in 2016. If you look at mallard and teal at the top, immediately you can see that it's not until the fisheries objective or the harvest objective gets to 0.35 or even 0.5 do you begin to move away from the probability that you are being unsustainable. Confirming to us that the current harvest sits within a policy or societal comfort zone of harvesting, 40 to 50% of mallard or teal. So it's quite a high harvest rate. Whereas if we look at pintail and shoveler, pink-footed goose, golden-eye, common snipe, golden plover, pretty much any of the other species, we see that transition away from a high probability, a much lower harvest rate, which means the current harvest is already quite a low level and it becomes sustainable and sits with policy in a harvest area somewhere between 10 and 20%, which is actually quite a sustainable rate in most other waterfowl harvesting systems. So the results we find in this second piece of work finds that we essentially find very similar results to our first analysis, and the biggest contribution to the uncertainty isn't the model or the methods, it's actually your population size and harvest data. And these methods are sound. It's exactly the same methods that the EU task force has recommended that all EU nations use. We were just first out the gates. So which of those two factors, population size estimates or harvest estimates, are more uncertain, or are they equally uncertain? Now, I've done this deliberately slightly provocative slide. We've just gone through the Schedule 2 consultation about whether we should harvest waterbirds, which waterbirds should be harvested, should be available to legally harvest hunters, and which should not. And a lot of that was based on this piece of work that we did for the JNCC. And there's two reasons for raising this. Hopefully it'll become clear. So this is some quotes. They are literally from the JNCC schedule review, and that data is literally from the advice that we provided to JNCC. And harvest data is partial, it's limited, it's probably biased, and it's not always publicly available. We don't always have it at the right population level. Mallard releases are a problem, but I can show you how to deal with them. So we have these estimates, but this is a really important point. What really comes all the way through the Schedule 2 advice to DEFRA is that, unfortunately, the margins of error are an order of magnitude, and therefore they're not trustworthy. What isn't so prominent is the other piece of advice that we gave, that while this is all true, the current data combined with population estimates, they're still sufficient to allow assessments of sustainability of the harvest. And we will learn by making changes and learning from them. I want to focus a little bit more on this margins of error point. Why do we have this different language with the harvest estimates than we do with population size estimates? Most of our population size estimates of wintering waterbirds are actually just as variable as the harvest estimates. And we tend not to discuss how poor they are. We don't calculate confidence intervals for these estimates because they're actually the sums of raw counts. We make huge conservation decisions based on Webb's data, but BTO have always been cautious about that. We make decisions with Webb's data way beyond what the BTO are sometimes comfortable doing. And there's good reasons for that. There's very strong critique for the trim methods that are in the trends analysis in BTO, but we still make very strong conservation decisions with that data despite its uncertainty. This order of magnitude that claim about harvesting, it comes from us as authors. It's actually our quote, but it's actually erroneous. And I have permission from the report author who wrote that, Joe Madden, to share that with you. It's quite misleading because what it doesn't do is it doesn't correct the order. It doesn't correct the estimation of the confidence intervals relative to the mean population size of the waterbirds. And when you do that, which is what I've done in this plot here, and looked at the margin of error multiplier relative to the mean, we find it never reaches times 10. The maximum is actually for goldeneye, because it's a very small population size, very small estimate of harvest of about times 2. And if you compare that to one of our most numerous waterbirds, the mallard on the right there in grey, that is the margin of error multiplier for the estimate of wintering mallard, wild mallard in the United Kingdom. And so our estimates of harvest are really no more variable than our estimates of population sizes. So to conclude that part, is harvest sustainable? Yes, for most ducks, but there is some concern over most harvested mallard and teal. Some geese are over-harvested. The model choice and the assumptions matter, but it does demonstrate that such an assessment is possible with imperfect data if we embrace the uncertainty and lean into it. Therefore, I think it's fair to say that some form of formal evidence-based adaptive harvest management could start now. There's certainly not too much uncertainty, and this is aligned with EU and AWARE recommendations. I'm going to finish by briefly talking about our most recent work. It's literally just about to come out. The preprints out if you want to look for it. It's kind of motivated by this work that we've recently finished for Natural England on coastal wildfowling, where kind of combined with this piece of work, we started to look for other sources of data. You know, in a landscape for waterfowl, there's so many different threats for them. They can have good habitat, poor habitat, disturbance, refuges, hunting inland and hunting in the coast, and they're all different forms of pressures. Different hunters do different things. They behave differently and they produce different data, but we don't always have that data. The work up to now I've shown you is from the National Game Bag Census, a really rich and well-run long-term study of 700 shoots and providers. They're mostly formal shoots, but not entirely. It definitely includes reared and released pheasants and mallard. The data is not open access, and baiting and feeding of habitats to attract waterfowl occurs. Wildfowlers on our coast, that comes from a Crown Estate data. There's lots of it. It's often from wildfowling clubs. It's wild bird hunting, usually in protected areas. It has very small average bag returns, similar to what we find in North American systems, and baiting is illegal and is generally not practiced. The best estimate we can make is it's responsible for 2% of all duck hunting related mortality. But anyone else not hunting in a wildfowling club and not hunting in a formal shoot, we don't have any data. So these are independent shoots, farm shoots, rough shoots, flight ponds, private wetlands, and commercial guides. Whether they're releasing mallard or not, we don't know, and we know that baiting of wetlands with grain to attract waterfowl is prolific. So you can see a lot of slides, a few more slides with pictures of dead waterfowl, just as a warning. I don't think they're grotesque, but you will see them. So we looked to a new source of data. These are not the images used in the analysis I'm about to show you, but they're example photos. This was a piece of work that was quite challenging to do, and it required quite a took us several years to get ethical review permission for this, where we worked with Facebook to be able to analyse what we could see, the photos that hunters in the UK are putting online in 2 different Facebook groups over 4 years. And from this, for those of you that do birding, you can largely tell the species, and you can largely tell the sex, not always, but in most cases from these photos. So when we did that, we found some really interesting results. The plot here on the left is the percentage of the bag. It's the relative distribution, not the amount of the harvest, but the relative distribution of different duck species that are harvested, whether that data comes from the already published Abishire studies, the National Game Bug Census, from the Crown Foreshore data of wildfowling clubs, or what hunters that post on Facebook, what the relative distribution is there. And we can see some things that really jump off the screen and make sense. Widgeon, for example, are more likely to be shot by coastal hunters than anyone else, and that makes sense. Teal too, largely being as a coastal hunter, has a larger proportion of both widgeon and teal in their hunting bag than elsewhere, and these tend to use coastal sites. Using Facebook, it suggests that we're harvesting much more gadwall than either of the other two methods suggest. And this, to me, begins to make sense as well, because gadwall tend to use small gravel pits, fishing clubs, and very bespoke access requirements are going to be needed to be able to hunt these areas. And so where you get your data from completely changes our statistical estimation of how the estimation of 1.1 million waterbirds, the species-specific breakdown of that can be affected depending on where we get our data from. We've also done a little bit of work on thinking about where that harvest occurred. So looking at the details in the photo and saying, is this inland or was this on a coastal salt marsh or mudflat? And that had really interesting results where we can see this in the bottom right, the plot that suggests that people hunting inland have much higher bag returns or success, if you like, harvest success, than those hunting on the coast. And that supports some of the work that we've done using other methods from Natural England, where inland is 3 to 6 times higher than coastal hunting. We then tried to put that in the context of how many birds does that equal? What is the UK hunting bag? And in this slide, the thing I'm wanting you to look at is that we try to remove the contribution of released mallard to this story, because it's really important. This is the statistical estimate, and the estimate of total UK duck hunting and harvest is inflated by the number of ducks, the mallard ducks that we release. We release somewhere between 1 and 6 million mallards for hunting in the United Kingdom. It's a massive source of uncertainty, not knowing the exact number. And so this plot does the same as what we did previously, but it assigns that relative species distribution of harvest to the total hunting bag, using on the left-hand column of the plot the National Game Bag Census, where the bag is largely mallard. And then in the Facebook analysis, we can see that teal begin to have a much more significant role in the UK hunting bag if you ask hunters that post on Facebook instead of responding to the National Game Bag Census. And then after that, in each of the other groups, we have tried to deal with the uncertainty imposed by estimating the number of released mallard. If we remove those mallard, maybe looking at the uncertainty in release numbers, we can see we get a massive crash in the total number of wild duck harvested. And then if we add to that the uncertainty in the total number of duck harvested, we get a small change. When you're looking across this plot, I would like you to focus on widgeon. That's the darkest bar. And we can see that for National Game Bag Census, we get an estimate for widgeon. And this increases if we use hunters' data that comes from social media. When we remove the influence of released mallards from the statistical procedure, we see that that estimate declines again. So it almost seems like the estimate that's coming from the National Game Bag Census might be right, but it's really not for the right reason. It's not that it's doing anything wrong. It's set out to do something. It's done it correctly, exceptionally well. Nicholas is an insanely clever statistician. It's doing the right thing with the data it has. But this begins to show us how we can explore the uncertainty on what the right harvest estimate might be. So all of that's published now. It's if you want me to send through the papers, but you should be able to find them. The quotes are there on the slide. So uncertainty in harvest decision making. Conservation and hunting are both asking for evidence-based decision making when it comes to wildlife harvest. And there's a huge body of literature and success in applying it applying adaptive harvest management approaches in North America, Australia, and elsewhere. This is not just coming from independent authors. DEFRA themselves in 2018 have an unpublished report that says exactly that. So let's be frank about this. Uncertainty is not new, and we deal with uncertainty in many different ways in different wildlife harvesting systems. And it seems to me that given that we've got this robust evidence and robust methods, that it's time to move away from a solid focus on precautionary principle. That doesn't mean none, but certainly not a complete focus on precautionary principle. And I think if we do that, we have another tool, a potential tool we don't spend a lot of time on in the United Kingdom, which is utilitarian-based conservation, could be awaiting. Now, because of time, I'm going to finish there. There are a whole lot of other things that we're working on, and if you want to ask me about them, or if you want to follow up with us in the future, we're also working on very dedicated demographic studies of some of our waterbirds and mallard. We're now doing it on widgeon. And we're looking at HPI risks in both released mallard and wild mallard, and how you can tell the difference between released birds and non-released birds. And so please do come back to us in the future if you'd like us to talk about more of that. Thank you very much.
Tom, thank you so much. That was an incredibly interesting talk. We do have quite a few questions that have come in. For everyone listening, you've still got a few minutes to get a question in. If you get it in the next couple of minutes, we might have time to get to it. So please do that with the Slido link in the chat. The first question is actually from me, so I'm going to use questioner's prerogative and ask that one first. I used the software package called Vortex in my PhD for doing PVA analysis, and it seems like it does a very similar thing to Pop Harvest. I was wondering if you had any sort of comparison between the two, or if Pop Harvest is becoming like the preferred solution now.
So PVA is an alternative approach. In fact, in the report to JNCC, you will see a PVA. Didn't use Vortex, we used just a freeware, an R version of PVA. They do ask slightly different questions, but they can be forced to do exactly the same thing. One of the things about both packages which are poor is a really detailed understanding of the strength of density dependence in these populations. And so both standard PVA approaches have none, and Pop Harvest has some, but it's just simply based on surplus production. It's not based on a knowledge of the density dependence. And there's maybe some good reasons in that. Most of our waterfowl populations are suppressed. They're well below what they used to be 500 years ago. The historical literature is both a beautiful and depressing place to go and look at. One thing that's interesting, so that means that basically most mortality is probably additive rather than compensatory. But one of the things that is interesting is in European teal. European teal populations have been and continue to, till recently, have been really growing through the roof. And we've been underestimating their abundance, and they're growing and growing and growing. Canada geese too. Grey-lag geese too. And what we're finding now is that they are now reaching carrying capacity. And we're beginning to see some potential compensatory responses in their populations in response to higher mortality, particularly in Canada geese. So it's likely that on average, as America is experiencing, because they've got large but depressed duck populations, we've got large but depressed duck populations. Most mortality is additive. PVA and Pop Harvest should work. But if we actually are successful in recovering duck populations, which requires a different form of conservation in the breeding grounds, then we should then need to think about density dependence, and then the PVAs and Pop Harvest become harder.
I think that ties into one of the other questions, which is, do the models make allowance for any implications of social structure on productivity as well as total numbers?
No, not at all. And actually, we don't. There's only one thing that could. And I don't know if somebody wants to follow up and to make sure I've answered this right. There's two ways to look at it. It does make account for actual measured productivity in the field, right? Which therefore is a net product of whatever social structures are occurring. But one of the big things that they're finding is male bias in waterfowl populations, and that's becoming more and more common. Some of this is understood, beginning to be understood in potsherd, well understood in mallard to a certain extent in different parts, poorly understood elsewhere, but it's beginning to look like there might be a male bias in widgeon as well. And some of this is to do with that, sexual selection in these systems is promoting male bias. Some of it is thought to be recovering generalist predator populations in Europe in a landscape that doesn't really do well for waterfowl as a ground nester with recovering predator populations. So female mortality is much, much, much higher in the breeding season. And so there is some concern that whether or not we need to account for that. And the Americans have looked at this and found that it makes not a jot. So, really strong promoted male-only harvests in North America has made no difference to the model predictions or the observed population dynamics. Basically, only female survival in summer is predicting everything.
Right.
And so yes and no is the answer. Some people are. It's not very clear. It seems that it's really about female survival in summer.
Excellent. Thank you. Are there any new indicators that could potentially be developed using harvest and/or demographic data?
Oh yes, for sure. Do you want to do a PhD? Do you want to come and study? For sure. It's just not. And so one of the things that Hannah Coburn, my PhD student, she's nearly finished now. We're using this index of productivity called Duckling Watch. It's been trialed in the Netherlands. We're trying to do it in the UK. Everything about waterfowl is about productivity matrices. People have started to look at snow as reflectance in winter, and can that predict? Can the North Atlantic Oscillation predict it? Can the amount of precipitation predict productivity? Some years it does, and you go, yes, we're onto something. Other years it doesn't, and it doesn't make sense. So it's likely that the biggest driver is environment, but because other things happen in the north, these kind of predator cycles, lemming cycles, vole cycles, and climate change things that we don't yet understand, can sometimes are probably masking a lot of how clean that pattern is. Right. But the bottom line is more wet ponds as early as possible and for as long as possible in the boreal, we should get more ducks, but provided other things aren't happening. Like humans are really moving into the boreal in Russia for oil and gas production, and that could basically turn off the tap of ducks in Europe.
Amazing, thank you. And the final question we have for now is, someone would be interested in your views on the sustainability of harvest under the AWA Goose Management Platform, which I think is linked to from your JNCC report, which I've put in the chat.
So I've got two. I don't exactly know the question, but I have opinions. I have many of them. So I think that there are clearly some issues with goose hunting, and there's other geese that can be, quite sustainably hunted. I do have a lot of problems with the short stopping argument that, we've got, 500,000 geese and increasing of a given species, but it doesn't come to the UK anymore, and therefore we shouldn't shoot it when it does. I'm not convinced of that argument because it's hunted all across its range. But I think there are some real problem species like the lesser white front and our Greenland white-fronted goose. I advocate for kind of more policy-based regulation and working with hunters and conservation NGOs to come up with a system that works, because we tend to find that systems that are imposed, and on average, our hunters are well behaved in Europe. On average, I'm not saying they're angels, right? But compared to elsewhere, however, we tend to find systems that are imposed fail. So, and we know that from other systems, fishing, shell fishing, public access management. So it's really about engagement. And so, what do I think about it? I think the systems are really good, but I think it's all about engagement. And I'd like to encourage our regulatory geos to do as much positive engagement with these communities as I see them having with fishing. I don't really see them having that positive engagement when it comes to waterbirds.
Fascinating. That is all of the questions that we have had come in. Thank you again for an incredibly interesting talk. I found that absolutely fascinating. I know my colleagues will have done as well. I think I wouldn't be at all surprised if you were to hear from multiple people in JNCC as a result of that talk, potentially including me and my team. So thank you again, Tom, and thank you everyone for coming.
Thanks everybody. It was a real pleasure to speak to you, and we're happy to speak to you at any time.
Lovely. Thanks then. Bye-bye.